Okay, so my dog Elsa wanted to get in on the shot here, but in this video I hope to give you a bit of a primer on using time-lapse. And there's basically two kinds of time-lapse I do. One is from a stationary tripod, and the other one is from a slider. We'll talk about the slider a little later. It gives you a kind of a different perspective on the time-lapse. So very briefly, if you want to do sky shots, night sky shots, there's some typical simple rules you can follow. One is to probably get as wide open an aperture as you can. So your lens might be rated at, say, f3.5 or f2.8. Probably want to set it to that aperture, and you'll be using manual mode as well. So typically in night sky shoots, we're using exposures that could be anywhere from, say, 8 seconds to 30 seconds. Nominally around 15 or 20 seconds, I would say. So in addition, you want to get as wide an angle as possible if you're trying to encompass the entire night sky. And for a full frame camera, that could be, anywhere from sort of 18 to down to, say, 12 or even 14 millimeters. I think 14 millimeters is a very popular focal length to use. The other thing you're going to need, if your camera doesn't have a built-in intervalometer, intervalometer is something that fires the shutter sequentially with a particular delay that you set, and then opens the shutter for a particular length of time. So that over time what happens is that as the stars move, each subsequent shot is going to capture the stars in a different position, and that's what you want. When you take those files and put them into, say, a simple video editor, you'll see the motion of the stars in, if you want, real time, although it's not real time. So there are two ways of doing it. Sometimes cameras will have a built-in intervalometer. This is an older Canon 6D, it doesn't have it. So I purchased for probably $15 one of these intervalometers. And what you set on that intervalometer, or either internally in the camera if your camera has it, or externally on one of these, is usually just the delay between your shots and how long you want the shutter to remain open. In this particular case, this thing will actually hold the shutter open as long as you're in manual mode and you go to bulb. So in manual mode, you don't have to use the bulb setting. The bulb setting basically means the shutter will stay open as long as the shutter is pushed down, or that this thing holds it open. But if you wanted to use, say, 20 seconds, that's typically one of the choices that you have without going to bulb mode in your camera. So you might want to set it to that, and you might want to just set the intervalometer to fire for, say, 1 second. That way it trips the shutter stays open 20 seconds based on the internal timer in the camera itself. Well, let's have a look at a setting for the intervalometer. You'll notice at the top there's a bar that goes across as you move it with the joystick. And just to start on the left-hand side, there's one called delay. And basically that only works once. That's, I think, the time before your sequence even starts. Maybe you want to set the thing and then get out of the way so that you're not in the shot. So you might set a 5-second or a 10-second delay or something like that. But it's only used that one time. Then the next one on this particular intervalometer is called long, which means how long the shutter will stay open, or how long, rather, this thing will try to keep the shutter open. So if it's in bulb mode and you put, say, 20 seconds on here, it's going to hold the shutter open for 20 seconds. If you're using the internal shutter speed in the camera, then you should probably make that a bit shorter than 20 seconds so it doesn't trigger it a second time if their timing is a little bit different. The last one or second last one, is interval, and that's just kind of the delay between shots. So typically I set 5 seconds, and then when it fires the shutter the next time, it might open the shutter for about 20 seconds or something like that, depending on the exposure you need. And then you get to the last important one here, which is the number of shots. I typically will shoot anywhere from 150 to 300 shots in order to get a few seconds worth of, hello Elsa, a few seconds worth of video, because depends on the frame rate you're choosing. If you're using 24 frames a second, and you take 100 shots, you're only going to get about 4 seconds worth of video. So that you have to take that into consideration. And the last one is just a little thing that will play a tune for you when you, I guess, every time it fires off the shutter. So just to demonstrate to you this actually works, what I've done on the intervalometer is I've set a delay of 5 seconds. So when I press the start-stop button, it'll wait 5 seconds before it starts firing the shutter on this guy. I've also set the length of the shutter opening to just 1 second, because I'm using the internal shutter speed of 1/60th of a second in the Canon 6D, and so I just need to give it a kind of a blip to start the shutter. Now again, in night sky stuff, you're going to be dealing with much longer time intervals that you're going to leave the shutter open, but this is just daylight. We're just doing a little demonstration here. And I've left my interval at 5 seconds, so it means between each subsequent shot, it's going to wait 5 seconds. So let's, you should be able to hear this thing click. So right now I'm going to hit the start button, and it's now counting down on the intervalometer. There it goes, it shot and it beeped, and it's waiting another 5 seconds, taking another one. And I'm going to stop that sequence. But you get the idea. You set this thing, put the camera on the tripod, and go sit in your car and get warm while it takes all of the shots for you. Now, one of the other things that you should be aware of when you're out shooting at night is the dew point. Dew point basically says the temperature at which condensation starts to form. So if you look up what the dew point prediction is, and it says it's going to be plus 5 degrees C, and you know it's going to get down to, say, plus 1 that evening that you're out shooting, then you're probably going to have a little problem with condensation on the lens. What I typically do is take one of these dollar store fans, and I don't have one with me right now, and I just, every now and then, just sort of from the side, blow over the front of the lens so that it doesn't fog up, and that typically works. A lot of people just wipe the lens in between shots. I don't like doing that, but it's your choice. So those are the fundamentals of taking night sky time lapse, and I'm just going to show you an example here now. This is probably about 150 shots to maybe 200 shots. So it just results in a few seconds of video, and I think I put it into an editor at about 30 frames a second. So it's going to be 5 to 7 seconds kind of thing. But have a look at this, and we'll come back and we'll talk about how to use the slider to do time-lapse photography. Well, since the beginning of movie making, cinematographers have used something called a dolly shot. And that's where the camera actually moves rather than being fixed on a tripod and only giving the camera operator the ability to pan the camera. You're actually moving with the talent or the actor and getting an effect called parallax, which is where the background seems to rotate around the actor as the camera moves with the actor. Up until recent years, this kind of thing has been out of the domain of amateur filmmakers and even professional filmmakers because of the expense of the equipment. The movie industry has always had access to things like jib cranes, steady cams, and even dolly tracks where they actually lay down what looks like railway tracks and they put a cart on it, put the camera and the camera operator on there, and somebody pushes the cart to move along with the actor. Well, that stuff's been, as I say, out of the sort of the realm of affordability for most filmmakers. Then along comes the digital age, where suddenly in cameras like this, we're having the ability to shoot high definition video, or better. Some cameras now are up to about 8K. So manufacturers have kind of risen to the occasion, and in recent years they've come up with something called a slider, and this is a slider. And a slider basically allows you to emulate that dolly shot by moving the camera along a rather limited length track, but still you can get that nice effect of parallax. Now in the beginning, when they first started offering sliders, they were basically just two rails like this. They may have been aluminum, they may have been steel. In this case, they're carbon fiber. And there's a carriage that sits on top and just moves along those rails. Unfortunately, these manual sliders required a human to push the carriage along, and that requires probably that you hold your breath for a fair amount of time to make sure the shot is as smooth as possible. So then along comes, in more recent years, some companies like Edelchrome and Rhino, who have come up with what's called a motorized slider. So using stepper motors to actually move the camera much more smoothly than we could manually. Unfortunately, price again became an issue, because even today, kits like that by Edelchrome and Rhino can start out around the $2,000 mark and move up as you accessorize it. So then along comes this little Chinese company called GVM, Great Video Maker, who made this little rig for less than $500 Canadian. And guess what? It's motorized, and it will do time lapse for you. Now, I won't get into the particulars of how you set up this controller, but basically it's similar to what I was mentioning earlier about taking time lapses from a tripod. You have to set the time between shots, you have to set the duration during the shot, how long you want the shutter open, and you can do that through this controller. It's a little tricky. The documentation's not great with this, but it can be done. But what you're doing is having the camera actually move as it's doing that time-lapse sequence. So anything in the foreground seems to be moving relative to the camera, and then on top of that you've got, let's say at nighttime, you've got the stars moving as well. So you kind of get two sets of motion going on at the same time. Now the way it does that is it, again, couples through the shutter release, through a cable, and just so you know, it comes with a ton of cables, a bunch of different types of cables, so that whether you've got a Nikon, Olympus, Fuji, Canon, whatever, it will be able to connect to this thing. So they've got you covered there. What I'm going to show you next is a clip that I recorded earlier that talks about the different ways in which you can control the camera motion, both in time-lapse and in real-time video. But in this case, we're going to concentrate just on time-lapse. So there's two ways you can set this up. There's a bar running down the middle of the slider, which controls the carriage. And if you undo these knobs at the end and slide the bar or move the bar so that it's angled one way or the other, depends on how you do it, you'll either get a panoramic mode where the camera will do this. So it's always it's trying to cover an entire scene. Whereas the way I've got it set up now is so that it does what's called parallax or interview mode, commonly known as interview mode. And you'll see that the camera, instead of doing a panoramic where it's sweeping across, it's now always aimed at the object in the center. In this case, it's the camera lens on the camera you're watching this on. In that clip, I'd mentioned that we were going for the parallax or interview mode for shooting a guitar. So I'm going to show you that shot next. And what's in there are, first of all, a shot that was shot in the parallax mode, where the camera is actually always facing the guitar. And then there was one where the guitar neck is followed along, and that was just done in linear mode, where there was no parallax, no panoramic setup. It was just a straight, this rod in the center was just set to the middle. And then again, showing a parallax type shot, but with the camera traveling in the other direction. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so what you just saw was a series of time lapses that were shot to show the movement of the sun across the guitar. And so that each one of those sequences was about 60 minutes, just so you know, and about 200 shots. So there's a good example of using the time-lapse function on this GVM slider, where you've got actual camera motion as well as the camera being triggered to take shots sequentially. So next I'm going to show you an example of how this was used to do a night shot. Now, what I wanted to achieve in that shot was to have, again, some element in the foreground on Earth that was moving, seemingly moving relative to the camera, as well as capturing the sky at night. So I had to kind of light this building a little bit with a gelled down flashlight with some red light. But what I also had done was to mount this with a tripod on each end, and I need to lock this down. One tripod was lower than the other, so what I wanted to do, and I'd have the camera facing this way, actually uphill, more or less, but using a panoramic sweep rather than the parallax sweep, which we just showed you. And what that would do is that as this thing was traveling uphill, it would sweep past the building and kind of follow the stars of the Milky Way as they moved around naturally with the Earth's rotation. So without saying anything more about that, let's go and have a look at that clip. So there you go. I hope this wasn't too much information, too overwhelming for you or whatever. Keep in mind that every DSLR and mirrorless camera can allow you to do this. You don't need a slider. You can use a tripod. You don't need to shoot night sky if you don't feel like it. You could shoot people walking down a street or traffic or anything like that. Everything is a potential target for time lapse.